Imagine this, a modern environmentalist movement turning on its head and hurting both the environment and the poor working class in the process. If that seems unlikely, it has become a daily reality for the thousands of Dutch farmers who have been financially squeezed into bankruptcy for the sake of some warped virtuous ideas by their government. I think you need to hear this synopsis by Jordan Peterson because what's going on in the Netherlands is a scary prelude to what may be coming to your country too.
First thing is that we've seen now a tremendous amount of unhappiness on the Dutch farmer front. So the judicial authorities in Holland accused the Netherlands government of failing to live up to its international obligations on the pollution amelioration front and required immediate action to be taken with regards to nitrogen pollution, which admittedly can be a problem. Now, the plan that the Netherlands imposed by compulsion will result in the destruction of a substantial proportion of the Netherlands farming infrastructure. And the people who are promoting this say, well, we think the sector can be resilient enough to manage this. But the farmers know perfectly well that many of them are going to be forced out of business, as the politicians themselves have not only admitted, but are aiming for. And now there is this approximately 30% reduction in the Dutch herd and the associated farms. And the politicians who are pushing this seem to think that the whole agricultural sector in the Netherlands, which is the world's second biggest exporter of agricultural products, that the infrastructure there will be able to tolerate this forced and compelled reduction in supply and consequent increases in costs. But my sense is the whole agricultural section will stagger and fall, especially under the weight of these post-COVID supply chain problems. I mean, I can't see how you can take a whole industry that runs on about a 3 to 5% margin, force a 30% reduction in its inputs over an 8-year period, and expect the whole system to survive. Now,
they don't expect it to survive. They don't expect it to survive.
Oh, okay, we'll get into that. Now, just to add a little twist to that. Now, the Dutch farmers are out protesting. There's 40,000 of them with their big tractors, and they don't do that lightly because those tractors are expensive and they're very busy. And right in the bloody midst of this, our prime minister did exactly the same thing. He unilaterally announced a mandatory 30% reduction in nitrogen output, and he, on the farmer side, and he wasn't even willing to tie that to units of nitrogen used per unit of food produced, because apparently he doesn't give a damn whether we produce food effectively. And then that means that poor people will go hungry.
The language around this can be deceiving, as there's something deeper that we're perhaps witnessing. It's a strand on the far left of the environmentalist debate that sees human action and flourishing itself as a detriment, taking the idea to its extreme. Take, for example, the EU regulations and goals that are forcing the Dutch economy to undergo this massive shift in such a short period of time. It's things like the EU Habitats Directive and the Nitrates Directive that want to cut down nitrogen emissions by a massive 50% by just 2030. A government that ultimately feels the pressure from these larger EU directives has to comply, and the result of that is seeing the anti-growth strand of the environmentalist movement start to justify cuts to agricultural production and livestock farming that risk toppling over the entire agroeconomy of the world's second largest cash crop exporter. In a lot of cases, farmers had to cut down their herds and farms by over 30%, just to be able to meet the stringent nitrogen emission requirements, eventually making some of them go bankrupt and be acquired by the government for much cheaper. And you know what's crazy? Nowhere near the same level of high-handedness as the agricultural sector from the Dutch government was seen in the industry and transport sectors to curb emissions. And it's quickly made clear that the poor farmers were becoming scapegoats to make the EU regulators happy, rather than actually working to limit emissions for the sake of the environment. Predictably, it spilled out into nationwide protests and blockades by the farmers.
This isn't even good environmental policy. It's not going to work. And I don't know what's going to happen in Sri Lanka, but my suspicions are the people are going to be cutting down the forests and eating the animals, because what the hell else are they going to do?
Exactly. You're absolutely correct. I don't believe that they expect the survival of the system. And the policies are created largely because they don't believe that system is worth keeping. And they've said it to the farmers in the Netherlands. They've said that to them. In some places, the nitrogen reduction content is up to 90% if it's near conservation in the Netherlands, up to 90%. And remember, these farmers, including our farmers, they have been approached about this net zero before. This is not the first time. And they were told, if you invest in innovative technologies, that would bring down your carbon footprint, and therefore you would get some credits for that. And so many of those farmers in the Netherlands, they spent millions of dollars investing in innovative technology. And then after that, the government said, what? That's not good enough. Then they brought in the nitrogen requirements. So then they imposed the nitrogen requirements upon an already fragile industry. And then the Dutch farmers said, well, we will not be able, exactly like in Sri Lanka, to make the yields that it would be worth financially us continuing this industry. And what did the government say? Well, if your farms can't sustain itself, they're not sustainable. We'll buy them, or a corporation will buy them from you, but we cannot continue to invest in an unsustainable business. And when the Dutch farmers come out and say, well, we are one of the largest exporters of cash crops, certain cash crops, what does the government say? Oh, no, you're not. You import a lot of the things that you need to produce that. And so when you minus that from the equation, you're actually negligible in the world scheme of the food supply chain. So they have an answer for everything.
Have we learned nothing from history? Disturbing the critical balance of supply chains and profit margins with massive cuts like this can threaten food supply and send prices to the moon. And in the case of a country like the Netherlands, its agricultural produce is closely linked to its economy and foreign exchange as well. Anyone that knows what the Holodomor was in the lead up to the Second World War in the Soviet Union understands how human action can create the most devastating famines in history. That happened in what is modern-day Ukraine, also called the world's breadbasket today. Farmers were driven out or taken out of business, agricultural land was taken over the state, and the food supply was strictly capped and managed. In the single year of 1932, nearly 7 million people passed away from starvation in one of the biggest man-made famines in recorded history. Perhaps keeping that in mind shows how dangerous it is to tinker and tweak a functioning system, especially when it relates to a vital and immediate need like food, and food security of millions of people should always be regarded as having a paramount importance.
And not only that, when the Dutch farmers said, okay, let's look at if this is really about the environment, and the Canadian farmers are saying the same thing, let's look at our contribution and the contribution that we make to carbon sequestration. When we plant crops, carbon is sequestered in the soil. And so do we get, in Canada, the question's asked, do we get a reduction from our carbon tax that we're paying to dry the crops? Can we get a reduction on that carbon tax? And the answer is no. In the Netherlands, what was the answer? The government basically said, well, no, you don't get to do the calculations. We are the ones who set the calculations. So the metrics, they don't even want to negotiate on the metrics, which tells you how dictatorial this whole process is, when you cannot even have people who have tended to the land for generations, who are probably some of the most experienced farmers in the world, where you say their input is not valid. It tells you that there is an agenda beyond just protecting the environment. Because if it were just protecting the environment, you would want all of these viable inputs, and you would want to say, okay, this practice, if it can be done in a sustainable manner, let's do it. No, you impose a restriction that you know will kill the industry.
Unfortunately, that's what the Netherlands started to become after Mark Rutte's 13 years in power, resulting in the rise of people on the other extreme end with someone like Geert Wilders, The thing about the environment is that anyone looking to make it better cannot do that without having many sectors of the economy and a large section of the population behind him. That's because any serious or impactful action is going to require trading growth and economic prosperity for it. It's going to require higher taxation to fund large infrastructure projects like dams or wind farms in the short term, and most importantly, it's going to send ripples through many industries that need to keep standing to make sure the edifice of the economy does not crumble. When you look at all of that in totality, you start to see how the hasty and unilateral actions by the Dutch government are only doing more harm than good, potentially even tipping the balance of the country's vital food production and export. That's not a balancing act that any country in the world can pull off in such a short amount of time, and it seems like Canada under Justin Trudeau is not learning any lessons. Just last year, Canada introduced their 2030 emissions reduction plan, meant to slash their emissions by a third till 2030, and then go zero by 2050. It's not that goal in itself that people have a contention with, but the sacrifice and scapegoating that will be done to get there. And unfortunately, the bulk of the price is often paid by the man at the bottom of the supply chain, who happens to be the same guy that these parties came in promising to uplift. Jordan Peterson for long has been calling out the moralizing around climate change and wanting for the tough conversation to happen around the issue as it relates to the economy. Perhaps seeing an example of what happens when this unguided virtue translates into policy in a country like the Netherlands can make people realize that the issue is a lot more nuanced and complicated than merely setting unrealistic targets and sacrificing everything else at their altar to meet them.